AM 1150 with lawyers from FH&P covering various legal topics.
Tuesday morning, and Carolyn Cyfra joins me, a family law specialist practicing exclusively in family law.
I do, yes.
I need you to get closer to the microphone. You have a small voice.
Okay. How's this?
That's much better.
Perfect.
Why family law?
I think that in Kelowna, it's kind of an interesting market because you have a lot of people who retire to Kelowna, so they've got a big fat pension, a big fat RRSP, or they've paid off quite a bit of their home and they have a lot of equity in their home. So with kind of the demographic that exists in Kelowna, family law is just a huge exploding area because people have a lot to argue over when you're, my age and you have only debt to split. There's not a lot to argue over, but when people are retirees and they retire into the Okanagan, they have a lifetime worth of assets and things that they put together. So there's a little bit more to argue over. So it's just kind of a really big area in Kelowna.
And yet, and I don't know if I know partly I'm right on this, is that there's the impression that Kelowna is an old people's city. That people, that you come here to die, you come here to retire, you come here to bring your life to a close, and yet there is this huge exploding demographic of kids being born. We're still building schools. Where we keep moving portables onto school sites because there's just no more room. And Kelowna has this burgeoning university, young families, the college, technical, high tech. There's a huge segment of this market that is young people with kids.
Well, yeah, there are a lot of young professionals who can't afford to live in Vancouver, and a lot are moving into the Kelowna area because, well, I think at once upon a time it might have been a little bit more affordable. I'm not sure that will be the case moving forward.
You got to be a lawyer if you're going to buy a house here.
I guess so. Yeah, that's right.
So now listen, when it was proposed or suggested that this might be an area of exploration, I absolutely agree totally. And so let me go back to my opening statement where statistics, as far as I understand them, suggest that probably 50% of all marriages that start out with wedding bells and smiles and tin cans on a bumper behind a car end in disaster. Would you somehow think that those statistics are probably pretty valid?
Well, those are the statistics I hear, and then exclusively practicing in family law. Right. That's all I deal with all day.
You see it as well.
So my view on it might be a little bit skewed because I only deal with people, generally, who are either going separate ways or have some assets to protect going into a marriage and are being kind of cautious. So my view on the world might be a little bit skewed personally.
So what we're really here about this morning then is for you to say, given the number of cases that I've handled over time, I have now come to the conclusion that I'm about ready to start writing my book. And here are the elements that need to be in place because clearly if anybody's going to sound a warning about what to be aware of and what to do before you take that magical trip down the aisle with the bells ringing, there are some things you absolutely have to do.
Absolutely, and there are some cost ramifications to keep in mind as well. Trials, if you go to a full trial, can cost $30,000, $50,000, $80,000, and that can happen very, very quickly.
That's unreal.
I think that the statistic is somewhere around 95 to 98% of things settle prior to trial. The problem is that if you're paying a lawyer all the way up to the very bitter end and then you settle right before trial, you've still paid a lot of money. So if people can give some consideration to these things ahead of time and try to come to some sort of agreement, they can forego a lot of that cost and not worry about the stress and the cost associated with trial. And
so I'm hearing a lawyer that says pay me a little bit up front so you don't have to pay me a whole lot later?
Absolutely.
Good on you.
Yes, well.
That doesn't...
It would make my job a little bit easier, I think, too.
So this is just self-preservation that we're talking about here. Do you find it depressing? Do you find it troubling? I mean, I recognize you're in a business, and so you over time acquire some talents of isolating yourself. It's just another tragic breakdown of a relationship. But when you see assets being divided and nobody comes away a winner, when you see kids being drawn and quartered kind of thing, when you see some of the anger, does it sadden you?
I think specifically things related to children can be a little bit difficult. What I understand about lawyers is either you can do family law or you won't touch it with a 10-foot pole.
Right.
It's a very polarizing area of law just because some people don't want to get involved in splitting grandma's silverware. It's the children that can get a little upsetting when people are calling police or they are making allegations that are maybe a little bit unfounded.
Where you're suggesting that my spouse is a predator or is an abuser, and there's absolutely no truth, but it makes a good story, and it
it strengthens someone's case in going to court. And so I think those are the times where it gets a little bit difficult. But otherwise, there are people who are going through one of the most traumatic life experiences that you can. It's very life changing. It's very difficult. It touches a lot of different people.
It's like a death in the family, really.
Absolutely. It's not just the two people. Then you have children. You have extended family members. So there are a lot of people who are going through a sensitive time. And so we can help to navigate those waters. And we don't have a dog in the race. We're not emotionally invested, so we can sometimes be a little bit helpful in kind of, being a reasonable mind approaching some of these topics.
Yeah, and I don't mind admitting, and I've admitted to my audience before, I've failed a couple of times, and so the idea of embarking on that adventure anymore has no appeal whatsoever. But my son at now 23 has effectively lived with me since he was 5. But I was lucky in that my ex and his mom determined that, it's better if he lives with you. Mm-hmm. He's bonded with you, you're his rock, and so we quite easily, came up with whose birthdays when, and celebrating Father's Days and Mother's Days, and alternating Christmases, and, putting him on a bus here in Kelowna and sending him to the coast for a 3-day visit on certain long weekends. It's easy. It was easy for me. I can't imagine. I've only heard the horror stories, and there are the horror stories far outweigh the good stories like mine.
Well, in my line of work, maybe, just because sometimes the more reasonable people just come to us for a separation agreement or to kind of finalize the terms. Sometimes we get more involved in the ones where people can't see eye to eye. But just as it relates to the children, really the only test that matters under the new Family Law Act that came in, I think, in 2013, so it's a few years old now. At the end of the day, anything to do with parenting time, contact with the children, the only test that matters at the end of the day is what's in the best interest of the children, not what's in the best interest of the parents, not what's most convenient for them. It's always what's in the best interests of the children.
And maybe at that point we'll take a quick break here, and when we come back we're going to go through, I think you had suggested there were 4 principal elements or critical elements that we need to be considering. The first of those is child support. We're going to be back with Carolyn Cyfra in just a moment.
AM 1150 with lawyers from FH&P covering various legal topics.
On this Tuesday morning, as always, talking in conversation on Tuesdays about the law, the legal challenges of life with FH&P lawyers. Carolyn Cyfra is in studio with us, and we're talking about family law, and in particular the things that need to be in place long before you take the magical trip down the aisle. Carolyn, number one thing on your list, as I understand this, is determining child support. Get it ironed out ahead of time.
Well, this, I would say, is on the separation side. You probably can't work out child support when you're, walking down the aisle. I think.
Truth.
Yeah. So this is kind of when you're going separate ways. But yes, child support is something to give some consideration to. Child support is based on incomes, and so the one thing that I end up telling people fairly often is that it's not only what's on your income tax return at the end of the year. There are some things that will change that. So, for example, if you pay union dues, that can reduce your income that your child support will be calculated off of. Or in other circumstances, for example, some people who work up north, they'll have a living allowance or they'll have accommodation that's provided to them. So the fact that they get a benefit can actually be imputed as income to them. So it's not just what your line 150 income is on your tax return at the end of the year. It can kind of be massaged up or down given the circumstances.
And that's what you do, massage things up and, just sort of determine, this works, this doesn't, this works, doesn't. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and then the other thing I'd say about child support, which kind of leads into or touches on what we were just mentioning, is child support is related to parenting arrangements. So, for example, if you have one parent who has primary residence and keeps the children, most of the time, generally that parent will be the child support recipient, and the one who doesn't have primary care would be the payor. If you're in kind of a 50-50 or a shared situation, which is actually like the cutoff is a 60-40 kind of thing, generally what is done is a set-off. So you look at what each parent would pay and then subtract the lower amount from the higher amount, and only the difference is paid between parents.
Is this basic math or is this high mathematics? Does this become quite convoluted? And I'm going to assume one should never, but depending on the amounts of money that are earned, the kind of position, the kind of job, it becomes exceedingly more complex as the amount of cash or cash flow goes ever upwards.
More complicated in actually determining what the income will be, but once you have it sorted what the incomes are, and sometimes that makes sense for people who are, employees, they don't receive any extra benefits, they don't have any other companies that they get dividends
from. Very few write-offs.
Yeah, so for people who are just employees, you can probably go to your income tax return, and then once you have the number, it's actually very simple. So on the federal government website, there's a child support calculator. So you type in what your income is for the year, how many children, what province, and it pops out a number at the bottom. And child support is kind of a black and white. You don't get to negotiate too much. Again, these are general statements. Sometimes you can in certain situations, but generally child support is a number that gets determined by
divided by 12 or divided by 52.
It would be the number that pops out on this website is a monthly payment.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I find myself saying, are we here at that point because of all the misadventures that have taken place, and finally philosophically in this country, or finally from a responsibility point of view in this country, we realized that we really need to protect the kids, and so these formulas have been devised and have been ironclad, I guess, for lack of a better way of defining it.
Yeah, I think that that's exactly right. I think that child support is the right of the child, not of the parent to receive it. So again, we're always looking to the child. What do they need to meet bare necessities and to have a roof over their heads, have clothing, food, to take part in extracurricular activities, those sorts of things. It's always what does the child need.
And does the parent that is writing the bigger of those checks have any right whatsoever to monitor how that money is being spent? If every month I am writing a check or every month I am depositing money into a bank account, what are my rights as the person who is providing that income to see where the money is going?
Generally, you would not have many rights at all, if
really?
any. Yeah, that's something that I don't know a ton about, but I think that when someone has primary residence.
So the custodial parent with the primary resident has all the power, and the check writer, that's your prime function, is to write that check and keep that money flowing.
Not to put too fine a point on it, but yes.
All right. And all of these things get spelled out in a multiple-page document.
That's right.
Now, does this sort of fall within the larger category? I mean, obviously this has nothing to do with prenuptial, because it's always after the fact, when you really roll up your sleeves and have to get down to the serious business of dividing the assets, dividing the child, dividing time, dividing celebratory holidays. Mm-hmm. There are so many elements that are there.
Yeah, sometimes what happens ahead of time, so a prenuptial or what's called a cohabitation or a marriage agreement, I think colloquial they're called prenup. Mm-hmm. Those things can touch on and affect things later on down the road. So one example of that is spousal support. So there are 3 bases for determining spousal support. One is compensatory. So that's generally speaking, it's, a mom who took time out of the workforce and Dad went on and advanced his career, and now he earns an income.
He's got his PhD, and I've got the ironing board.
Exactly. So that's one of the bases for spousal support. The other one is non-compensatory, which is just needs-based. Dad's living in $1 million house up on the hill. Mom's got nothing to her name. So the courts will kind of, look at what the needs are of the recipient. And then the other one is agreement-based, or an agreement, so something like a prenup. So if you address spousal support and things like that ahead of time, that can affect things down the road at the end of the day, and the courts may take into consideration what you contemplated at the time of the prenup.
As I listen to you say that, I recognize your tongue was in your cheek a little bit, and you were making a comment. Dad's got the $1 million house over here, and Mom, is living in a basement suite, looking through a window well, trying to see the sunshine, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Does that, however, typify, or is that? Are you saying that because you're aware that to a great extent that is what happens societally?
I don't think there's generally that huge a disparity, but it could happen. And the other thing I should say is it's not always, Dad who walks away with a very advanced career and whatever.
Because at times Mom does.
Absolutely. Or if they have any children at all. I've worked on a number of cases where the wife has been the sole breadwinner and the husband stayed home for, a 30-year marriage. So I'm just kind of generally
okay. No,
depict it.
And that's why I appreciate the conversation. I really do appreciate the conversation that on one side it's hardcore reality, and then over here it's somewhat philosophical,
mm-hmm.
and somehow those two pieces do come together. The philosophical side of really what we wish or hope or ideally or philosophically something should be at many times doesn't reflect the hardcore realities of life.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I have noticed myself is that I think, again, to speak in general terms,
mm-hmm.
sometimes older couples, one has been kind of in charge of the finances, whether that's he or she. One person has kind of been driving the bus as it relates to
mm-hmm.
the finances, and so the other one doesn't know a lot when they go separate ways. And so one of the first questions that we'll ask people all the time is, okay, approximately how much do you earn per year, and approximately how much does the other person? And I'm always surprised when the other person says, I have no idea at all what the other person is making, just because they've kind of not been involved in the finances.
Yeah.
So in a situation like that, the example of someone living up on a hill, and
it always seemed like we had enough money.
Exactly. Well, in that circumstance, it might be a little bit easier for there to be a larger disparity, just because if one person doesn't know what there is to be split, it's a little bit more difficult to kind of. But
that's when you, as their legal representative, demand access to the books, and
right.
And that's where the accounts and the bank accounts and the checks and the canceled checks and the auto debits all appear, where you have a chance to now go through and start to do some analysis.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Property division.
Property division. The only thing that I would mention on that is that there is a concept called excluded property, which comes up pretty often. So what that is that inheritances that a person receives, if it's made out specifically to one of the two parties,
right,
are generally exempt from being split. Again, there are exceptions to this. Or if at the time that people got married, one had quite a few assets, or, if they started to live together at the 2-year mark, there are ways to exclude from the family pot what someone brought into the relationship, or things like inheritances and gifts.
Actually, I'm appreciative that you're here, because I've had somebody who was talking to me about their concerns about their daughter. Their daughter's a university student. They've bought for their daughter up on University Hill up there, close to UBCO. One of these smaller, 385 square foot small apartments kind of thing,
mm-hmm.
To put her into, so that she will be close. But the dad has expressed to me, and it's funny that we're having this conversation. He said, listen, you talk to these lawyers all the time. What if her boyfriend moves in?
Mm-hmm.
And if her boyfriend moves in, we as a family bought this for her. But if her boyfriend moves in and stays in there for 2 years, does he suddenly become half owner of what we bought her to facilitate her going to university? And I said, geez, I don't know. And it's amazing that you're here so that I get to ask that question.
Well, I don't know that I have enough information. What I would say is I think it would depend whether it's in, her name,
Right.
or the parent's name, whether or not they make it to the 2-year mark and have lived together for 2 years. There are a few different things to look at there. But that's not an abnormal claim to make. In fact, it happens, I think, quite often, where one of the spouses claims on property owned by a third party, like the parents.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's a scary scenario.
It is, yeah. And so that's something we can consider with doing something like a cohabitation agreement to say, he's not going to have any interest in the home. And that's something that people should think about in the event that they're going to be living together and someone's putting more into a down payment than the other person or something like that. There are some considerations too.
Well, I know that this was undertaken recognizing what's going on with the market. And the phrase was, if we don't get her into something soon, we won't be able to afford to help her do it either. So they came up with a downstroke, and so the property was purchased, and she's now moved in. But she does have a boyfriend, and he has a tendency to sleep over here and there, and so they really are. They're very concerned, though, knowing that there's this 2-year window, and that on a certain date at the stroke of midnight kind of thing, suddenly that interloper, in the eyes of the parents, he's very much an interloper. In the eyes of the parents, he's very much someone who they wouldn't wish in their worst nightmare, and yet at the same time they find themselves saying, we could be in trouble here, because I don't think they have that piece of paper.
Well, one of the other interesting things that we deal with as it relates to what you're talking about here is when the date of cohabitation actually begins, because oftentimes people have very different ideas. So one might not give up, for example, he might not give up his apartment until much later, but he's spending all the time there. So is the point of, cohabitation when he gives up his own apartment, or is it when he starts to spend a lot of time over there? So that's another one of the things that we will look at, and we'll start to look at bank records. I did one where a lady was moving into town from Calgary, and so we actually went back to their bank records, I think in the 80s or 90s, and we saw when her purchases changed from Calgary grocery stores to Kelowna grocery stores, because then we could tell that she had moved to Kelowna, and we knew that when she had moved to Kelowna, she'd moved in with her husband. So that's what we had to do, to go back and actually work out the date, because we had to value his excluded property at that time.
Right.
So we needed a date.
Do you write a blog? Is this on your website? Is there information on this that's going to go up on the FH&P website?
It certainly can. Yeah, I think we have some other family law topics up there right now. But I'm working on one as it relates to the separation agreements and things to consider and to talk about with your spouse as you're going separately.
Is there a larger checklist?
I think it's just really these 4 issues, and then the smaller kind of issues that come out of these 4. But these are really at the heart of family law. There are really only kind of these 4 issues to deal with. So as long as you've considered or talked about or come to some sort of agreement as it relates to child support, parenting arrangements, spousal support, and property division, you should have a pretty good handle on things.
You're welcome to come back at any time. Truly appreciate your time here in our studio.
Thank you.
This morning so very much. She does specialize exclusively in family law. And if anything that we have touched on here this morning as part of our Law Talk conversations that we have with the lawyers from FH&P, I'm sure that Carolyn Cyfra would be happy to hear from you. Direct line?
448-0920.
Do that one more time.
250-448-0920.
All right. Pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
See you again in a couple of weeks.
All right.
Family law. If you want to know more about child support, about parenting arrangements, about spousal support or property division, you should contact her through the offices of FH&P. Are you up on their board of lawyers when you go and hear our lawyers?
I am, yeah.
You are there?
Yeah.
All right. Good to talk to you. Thank you so much. Back in a moment.